I still remember the first time I took acid, like it just happened yesterday. It's just one of those things, like the first time someone falls in love, or the first time someone has a child of their own. It becomes a watershed moment in the mind, a marker for the past. I just turned 17 a month earlier. My friend Ryan came up to me. "Jay, are you still interested in trying acid?" he said. My jaw dropped. I'd done mushrooms before, but finding acid around here, in our rural town, felt like searching for the Holy Grail. "Is it real?" I whispered, excited. "Well, everyone who has tried it says so," he said, his blue eyes gleaming with excitement. He had freckles on his light Irish skin, a chubby frame, and a dark sense of humor like myself. He also loved Tool and Alex Gray and A Perfect Circle, among other things. And we bonded over these. We used to have sleepovers where we would pack a bong with cannabis, but secretly put 20x Salvia divinorum extract underneath the layer of freshly ground buds. I got him real good a few times, and he always started slurring and say, "Oh, damn it, you bastard," before going off to that horrible place around the bend where the salvia spirit reigns supreme. The next day, we had a fire alarm. Ryan had gotten the acid the previous night, and our paths ended up crossing in the parking lot. I walked over, and he stared right through me. It was eerie. He looked right at me, but at the same time, he looked beyond me. "How was it?" I asked, excitedly. He had taken LSD for the first time in his life the previous night. "Jesus, it was intense," he said, a thin layer of sweat coating his face. "I didn't sleep all night. It felt like forever. I shouldn't have taken 3 hits at once. I nearly lost my shit a few times." I laughed at that. I knew I would never lose my shit. How intense could LSD be? It was just a chemical that made pretty colors swirl in your vision and slowed down time, right? I gave him $20, and he gave me 3 little pieces of white paper and some tin foil. "This shit is strong," he warned me. I nodded, and we parted ways. The last period of that day, I took out one of the hits and put it in my mouth. By the time the class ended, 55 minutes later, I felt like a man in the eye of a hurricane. Colors swirled around me, whizzing in a blur, covering all the hallways and floors in morphing kaleidoscope patterns. I walked home from school. Once I got to the empty baseball fields behind the school, I sat in the dugouts, packed a bowl, and smoked it. It was a mistake. By the time I stood up again, I felt like I was tripping so hard that I didn't know what the hell was going on anymore. I staggered home somehow and put on some A Perfect Circle. 3 Libras was playing in my room, but I felt paranoid and constantly watched. I heard voices coming from the house, and I knew I needed to get away. I ran outside without talking to anyone, heading for the woods near my house. I began hallucinating that the police were chasing me. Every time a car drove by, I expected it to suddenly swerve to the side of the road and a plainclothes officer to jump out and point a gun at me. Then maybe they would take me to some cold, dark torture chamber with fresh blood coating the steel tables. I heard megaphones blasting warnings from the police towards me, but I couldn't figure out where they were coming from.
"Jay, give yourself up. We know what you did. We have you surrounded,"
it exclaimed, echoing across the pavement and the hills. I looked around frantically. "I didn't do anything," I said, running towards the woods. I heard 3 Libras blasting out from every tree as I drew near, as if thousands of speakers had somehow been wired to the forest. Paranoid, I quickly left the trail and got lost. I don't know how long I wandered in those woods, but the sun hadn't fully set when I left. I would guess about 5 or 6 hours passed, but to me, it seemed like an eternity. In those 5 or 6 hours, I experienced total ego loss. My first experience with LSD would have a deep and permanent impression on my mind, one that will last until I die, and maybe even after that, if consciousness continues. I remember staggering through spiderwebs, freaking out and ripping the crawling predators off my clothes. Ticks crawled on me, and I had a sense of overwhelming anxiety about the ticks and spiders, thinking they had gotten into my clothes. I had a little notepad with me, and in bizarre scrawls, I wrote nonsensical sentences. "The sun is standing on my shoulder. The shadow people hide behind the trees. This has happened before." The trees bent in towards me, and the ground rippled up and down in endless, beautiful waves. When I closed my eyes, I saw a morphing wall of colors, like a Persian carpet melting into new designs. That was just my first time. I learned how to control acid after a while. By this point in my life, I've eaten tens of thousands of hits, but nothing ever gets you like the first time. Now, 20 years have passed, and a lot has happened since that April day in high school. I ended up meeting some members of the Grateful Dead families through mutual friends and by going to music festivals, people who introduced me to the source of much of the acid in the United States. Old hippies who have been passing down the recipes from big hand to small over the generations. Even though the Grateful Dead has been disbanded for years since Jerry Garcia died, the families still usually call themselves the Dead or Rainbow Families. But this isn't an autobiography of how I got involved in distributing millions of hits of acid. The horrors I witnessed occurred on a single trip out in the desert yesterday, when things went unimaginably horribly wrong during an initiation of a new member. Ryan and I pulled up to the site in the SUV, loaded with camping gear, food, beer, coffee, and everything else we would need. I got out and lit a cigarette, looking across the endless dunes, seeing the naked scrub brush reaching skywards with its crooked branches, like arms raised in prayer. We started setting up the campsite when another car pulled up behind us. Out of it came the de facto leader of our little family and his new initiate, followed by one young woman that I knew well, a new member of the family named Isabella. The way the October sun glinted off her earring made me pause. The blinding light reminded me of something, but I couldn't remember. I wanted to stop the whole thing right there. My intuition screamed at me to shut everything down, my subconscious sending forth waves of dread through my mind. The new member, a young man with tanned skin and a small gap in his front teeth, seemed like a fairly chill person. He smiled all the time, so we called him Smiley. With his long black hair, constantly covered in a steal-your-face hat, and his muscular frame, he reminded me of one of Robin Hood's merry men, like a medieval character brought to the present and given a tie-dye shirt and some ripped blue jeans. But strange things seemed to happen around him. I didn't know if psychic powers or mind reading or anything actually existed, but I couldn't find any other explanation. The week before, I had marked the first anniversary of the death of my mother. I hadn't told anyone, drinking away most of the day in sadness at random bars. When sunset came, I went back to my hotel room and laid down, deciding to sleep the rest of the horrible day away. As soon as I started falling asleep, I heard a hard knocking at my door. I rose from the bed, lethargically moving towards the door. As soon as I opened it, I saw Smiley standing there, not looking like his normal happy self. "Your mother wants you to know that your grandmother and grandfather are with her, reunited at last," he said, his eyes looking blank. His pupils seemed to expand and contract before my eyes, his eyes vibrating and twitching to the left and right in small, spasmodic movements. On an eternal beach they lay, staring up into a dead star. When I asked him about this later, he didn't remember any of it. He claimed he had a problem with sleepwalking and sleep-talking, yet this hadn't been the only time Smiley had exhibited strange powers. Storms had a tendency to follow him wherever he went, vicious eruptions of lightning and hail that would shake the ground. And when Ryan's dog ran away, Smiley had been able to wander through the pitch-dark woods and bring it back without even seeing where it had gone. There were other times, too many to count. I had a strange feeling about keeping Smiley around, one that I didn't share with anyone else in the group. "You ever done a thumbprint before, Smiley?" I asked him that morning. He shook his head. The thumbprint. I probably should explain what it is. To become a member of any crystal LSD family, an initiate must do what is called a thumbprint. This involves sticking one's thumb into a pile of crystal LSD and licking it off. LSD is extremely potent, and a single hit is about 1/10 of a milligram, smaller than a grain of salt when seen in crystalline form. A thumbprint is therefore a massive dose. If I had to guess, I would say it's the equivalent of taking between 1,000 to 3,000 hits of acid at once. It kicks in instantly, and it is one of the most intense experiences a living human being can ever know. Since LSD is non-toxic physically, it poses no risk to the body, even at incredibly high doses, but psychologically, it can destroy someone who is not ready for it. Because of this, we work our way up to a thumbprint. Many of the family members will eat 30, 40, or 50 hits a day to get their tolerance up and push the limits of their consciousness before embarking on a thumbprint. No one ever just goes into a thumbprint blind. Some people have talked about near-death experiences. The thumbprint is a beyond-death experience. People who take this dose of LSD see themselves dying and often hear the voice of God, deep and roaring like the sound of rushing water. They go into the light, and what they see there cannot be explained. I could say they see the divine hearts of Jesus, or Nirvana, or an eternal consciousness, but none of that would really describe it. They're just words, after all, and people too often confuse the map for the actual territory. I can tell you, I've never met a single person who has done a thumbprint who did not believe in life after death. To get to that level of psychedelic awareness, one must have a great deal of inner peace and spirituality. Any anxieties or depressions would be massively amplified by 1,000 or more hits of acid. And some people have tried to commit suicide during the thumbprint experience, even attempting to jump out of windows. Therefore, anytime a thumbprint was given, at least 5 or 6 members of the family would attend in addition to the initiate, and at least 2 members of the family would have to vouch for the initiate. "Hey, Jay, let me ask you a question," Smiley said, looking anxious and pale. He stared directly into my eyes. I saw an iron determination there and an inner calmness, as well as a strange underlying energy that I couldn't put my finger on. "How many thumbprints have you done in your life?" "I've done 3, I said, "and each time it was the most intense experience of my life. Are you sure you want to do this? Once you start it, you can't go back. After that, the only way out is forwards, and it's a long, hard road. It's a long, strange trip, my friend." He smiled at that. "Yes, I'm sure. I think I'm ready. Let's do this." I nodded, taking out the small vial of crystal LSD from my pants pocket. LSD was so potent that a vial that could fit into my hand would hold millions of hits. The leader of our group, a tall, elderly man we called China Cat, watched the laying out of the crystal with rapt attention, making sure the ritual was followed to the letter. China Cat's warm brown eyes sparkled as I poured the thousands of hits of the white crystal out onto a leather-bound copy of the Bible, his wrinkled face forming into a grin. Smiley reached his right thumb into the direct center of the pile, where the crystal LSD was thickest, covering the entire top half of his digit with it. "Whoa, soldier," I said. "That's a hefty dose. Are you sure?" I began saying, as he quickly raised it to his mouth, licking the thousands of hits off. It had to be one of the largest doses I had ever seen anyone take, at least 4,000 or 5,000 hits if I had to guess. Ryan stood next to me, and I gave him a worried look. His eyes looked wide and uncertain. I didn't know if Smiley realized what he had just done, as people doing thumbprints usually pressed their thumb into the side of the pile, where the crystal was sparser. LSD normally takes about 30 to 60 minutes to begin taking effect when it is eaten in normal doses, but thumbprints generally begin to kick in within 10 or 15 seconds, as the massive dose of LSD was quickly absorbed through capillaries and mucous membranes in the mouth. "It tastes zingy, slightly metallic," he said. Then his pupils began to dilate before my eyes. His face went slack, and within seconds I could tell the thumbprint had begun to change gears on him. His eyes began to fill with terror, and streams of light began to emanate from them. I know the difference between a hallucination and reality, and I was completely sober when I saw it. We all stood there, speechless. China Cat began to walk forwards towards Smiley, his hands raised as if approaching a madman with a gun. "I think," Smiley said, hesitating, his face pale and his eyes searching like an animal in fear of ambush. "I think we are in Rat's Alley, where the dead men lost their bones." "Smiley, are you—" China Cat began to say, and then the world rippled all around us, the dunes of the desert flickering, as if some giant power source had just been activated. I looked behind me, gazing out across the endless desert for a long moment. I saw the dunes rising and falling, churning like ocean waves in a storm. In the flickering, mirage-like translucence of the world, I saw another world behind the desert, something horrible and dark. From the horizon, the darkness began to overtake the translucent, dancing dunes, moving inwards towards us, changing the bright sands into a black, hellish landscape. The sun itself seemed to go out before returning for a few seconds, and then disappearing again, this time for good. Roads made of bones stretched across the flat, lifeless landscape as red clouds glowed overhead, covering the sky. The light that came through turned everything a shade of crimson, giving the packed earth a bloody glow. I turned towards Smiley, who I instinctively felt had somehow caused this, but he was gone. As the sun went out for the last time and the strange nighttime glow of this new world came over us, I saw something else standing in his place. It looked like a Halloween decoration, like a scarecrow crucified to some old splintering boards formed into a cross. Bones held together by rotten fragments of ligaments and tendons formed the shape of a human body, the skull hanging low over the chest. Black orbs appeared stuffed into the eye sockets, pure round balls that glimmered like obsidian. I stepped forward to examine the decoration closer when it raised its head. I screamed and jumped back, crashing into Ryan and Isabella. In a coarse, gurgling voice, the skeleton began to speak, its bleached jawbone opening and closing like a ventriloquist dummy. "I welcome all of you to the town of Scarville," he said. "A town where no one hides for long. My name is Mr. Grin, and I already know all of yours." None of us spoke for a long moment, all of us shocked into silence by the bizarre events of the past couple minutes. The skeleton kept staring straight ahead, totally unmoving, like an eerie, grinning statue. He pulled against the nails driven straight through the larger bones in his palms, small cracks forming as the bones made a crackling noise. "Is this some sort of manifestation of Smiley's mind?" China Cat finally said, stepping forward. "Did we accidentally get trapped inside of his hallucination or something? Because this is bizarre. I always knew Smiley was different from other people, but..." His voice trailed off as he looked around. I joined him, seeing buildings stretching out on the flat black earth, long barracks that trailed off towards the horizon, and old Western-style bars and apartments lining the nearby street. The street itself looked like it had been made by fitting arm and leg bones together, millions of them laid side by side. The bones had yellowed with age, contrasting heavily with the black plains that extended in every direction, without any hills or valleys in sight. "Oh no, Scarville is as real as you or me," he said, the grinning face of the skull moving to look at each of us in turn. "Some people are windows, the others are doors. A few are bridges, but most are bores." He laughed at this, a grating metallic sound that echoed through the silent town. "How do we get out of here?" I asked. The skeleton's head swiveled on his thin vertebrae, the glistening obsidian orbs of his eyes staring at me. I felt hypnotized as I stared back. "If I knew that," Mr. Grin muttered in a low, choked voice, "do you think I would still be here on this cross? I've lived in Scarville for 1,000 years now, and it's always the same. 1,000 years of dead earth, fire-red skies, and roaming nightmares, and I haven't found a way out yet." Our small group moved away from the skeleton man, deciding to palaver on what to do next. China Cat quickly took control of the conversation, as he always had. He was the leader of our family in times of crisis, and this certainly counted as a crisis. "I think we should take the skeleton down from the cross," he said. "What?" I asked, louder than I meant to. My voice seemed to echo back to me from the silent town. I felt like I had violated the sanctity of a graveyard. Lowering my voice, I continued huddling closer to the group. "Why in the hell would we take down that thing?" China Cat shrugged. "Well, we need help, and it is the only thing around, for starters." "I think it's a he," Isabella said, chiming in for the first time in the conversation. I looked at her in astonishment. "I don't care if it's a goddamn whale," I said. "It is a monster, a talking skeleton. Do we even know why he's crucified?" China Cat shrugged. "Let's ask him. I think we need a guide. Until we know what's going on here, we need to take any advantage we can get. I don't know where we are or how we got here, but I have a feeling that Smiley's behind it. If we can find him, then maybe we can get back to the desert," China Cat said. "Do we have any weapons?" Ryan asked, always the pragmatist. China Cat shook his head. I have some knives in the car, but the cars are gone, back in the desert, he said. It's whatever we have in our pockets now, unless we can scrounge something up from around town. I have a keychain folding knife, I said, pulling out my pathetic little 2-inch blade. Isabella waved her hands in front of her body in mock terror, saying, "Ooh," as if she were scared, and I laughed. I felt some of the tension relieved. I felt glad that, at the very least, I was in the company of friends who I trusted and loved. "Let's go talk to the skeleton," China Cat began when the roaring started from the horizon. I looked up and saw a behemoth slowly floating across the barren earth. It had a humanoid form, yet it must have stood hundreds of feet tall. Giant reptilian wings fluttered lazily behind its massive body, curved and sharp like those of a dragon, topped with green bony spikes. Hundreds of long, writhing tentacles draped from the bottom of its face, slithering and undulating as they stretched out towards the ground. "The Ancient Ones awaken," Mr. Grin whispered over and over, his head falling and raising, falling and raising. "The Ancient Ones, the Ancient Ones." I felt a rush of air as the figure floated over the town, much of its massive head obscured by the low, blood-red clouds. A tentacle as thick as a man's chest shot out and grabbed Ryan, wrapping around his body. It looked dry and dull, like the skin of a desert snake. Ryan's eyes went wide as it began to tighten around him. With a cracking of bones, I saw it crush him to death. Blood pouring from his eyes, mouth, nose, and ears as it compressed around his chest and neck. An explosion of blood shot out between the tentacles, a waterfall of blood streaming down the reptilian's skin into the black dirt below.